Tonight, we drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. The air in this ancient Sumerian temple is thick with frankincense and myrrh, the kind of sacred smoke that makes your eyes water just a little while priests in linen robes move like slow-motion dancers between towering columns carved with cuneiform that nobody alive can fully read anymore. You're here, impossibly, standing on polished stone floors that reflect the flicker of oil lamps, watching as a scribe carefully presses his reed stylus into soft clay, each wedge-shaped mark telling a story so old it makes the pyramids look like new construction. And honestly, you probably won't survive this. Not because of any physical danger, but because your mind might just melt trying to comprehend gods who descended from the stars, when your ancestors were still figuring out which berries were safe to eat. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because I'd rather have a small audience of genuine enthusiasts than a massive crowd of people who clicked by accident while looking for cat videos. And if you're feeling chatty, drop a comment telling me where you are in the world right now and what time it is for you. There's something wonderfully surreal about knowing we're all scattered across time zones, united only by our collective inability to sleep, and our fascination with ancient astronaut theories that make archaeologists weep into their trowels. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because we're about to explore the Anunnaki, those mysterious beings whose very name means, those who from heaven to earth came, according to the literal translation that sounds suspiciously like a science fiction novel, written 4,000 years before science fiction was invented. The mainstream historical fact we must anchor ourselves to is this: the Sumerians genuinely did write extensively about the Anunnaki in texts like the Eridu Genesis and various temple hymns, describing them as a pantheon of deities associated with Earth, the underworld, and the determination of human destiny. And these weren't just casual mentions, but detailed theological frameworks that influenced Babylonian and Akkadian religions for millennia. But here's where things get deliciously weird, because some researchers, and I use that term loosely, like calling someone who makes elaborate sandwiches a structural engineer, insist these clay tablets are actually describing literal extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago from a mysterious planet called Nibiru, which supposedly has an elliptical orbit so extreme it only passes through our solar system every 3,600 years, like the universe's most unreliable bus service. The scholarly debate, of course, rages like a particularly pedantic wildfire, with traditional Assyriologists insisting these are purely mythological constructs, reflecting Mesopotamian cosmology and social hierarchy, while fringe theorists point to surprisingly specific astronomical knowledge in these texts, and ask uncomfortable questions about how Bronze Age farmers knew things about planetary movements they theoretically shouldn't have discovered for thousands of years. Imagine standing in this temple now, the stone cool beneath your feet despite the Mesopotamian heat outside, watching as priests perform rituals that would seem utterly alien to modern sensibilities, chanting in Sumerian, a language isolate related to nothing else on Earth, which itself is either a fascinating linguistic mystery or proof that someone's ancestors came from somewhere very far away indeed. The tablets describe Anu as the sky god, the supreme deity dwelling in the highest heaven, and his children the Anunnaki, numbering anywhere from 7 to 50, depending on which text you're reading and which ancient scribe was having a better day with their counting skills. The smell of cedar wood burning mingles with the frankincense, creating an atmosphere so thick you could practically swim through it. And you notice the priests moving in synchronized patterns around a central altar, where offerings of bread, dates, and beer sit waiting for gods who, according to the mainstream interpretation, exist purely in the realm of human imagination and theological necessity. But the fringe interpretation whispers something else entirely in your ear. These offerings aren't symbolic acts of devotion, but actual provisions for physical beings who required sustenance, who walked these very floors with bodies as real as yours. who maybe didn't need the bread and beer but appreciated the gesture from their genetic experiments in the same way you might appreciate a macaroni necklace from a kindergartner. Touching, unnecessary, slightly confusing. The text called the Atrahasis, dating to around 1700 BCE but recounting events supposedly far older, describes a time when the Anunnaki first arrive on Earth and immediately start complaining about how hard the work is, which honestly is the most relatable thing ancient gods have ever done, because who among us hasn't started a new job and immediately wondered what fresh hell we've gotten ourselves into? According to these tablets, the younger gods, called the Igigi, are assigned the brutal task of digging canals and mining precious metals, presumably gold, which they do for approximately 40 shars. And a shar is 3,600 years. So we're talking about 144,000 years of divine manual labor, which explains why they eventually stage what might be history's first recorded labor strike. The mainstream scholars see this as a mythological explanation for social stratification and the development of agriculture. A just-so story explaining why some people dig ditches, while others wear fancy hats and tell them where to dig. The fringe theorists, naturally, see something more literal. Extraterrestrial miners extracting Earth's resources for purposes unknown, eventually creating humans as a worker species when their own laborers refuse to continue, which would make us the universe's most elaborate solution to an HR problem. You can almost hear the cuneiform stylus pressing into wet clay, that soft squelching sound repeated thousands of times as these stories get recorded, preserved, baked hard, buried, rediscovered millennia later by archaeologists who absolutely did not sign up for any of this theological chaos. The debate about whether these texts should be read literally or metaphorically has been raging since the 19th century, when these tablets first started being translated, with scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer insisting they're purely mythological, while researchers like Zechariah Sitchin, who, to be fair, was not a trained Assyriologist, and whose translations make actual experts in dead languages develop stress hives, argued for literal interpretation involving planetary collisions and genetic engineering. The temple around you seems to pulse with the weight of these questions. The stone walls carved with images of beings who look remarkably similar to humans, except for their strange conical hats and geometric precision in their poses, their eyes too large, their bearing too perfect, like they're posing for photographs that won't be invented for another 4,000 years. The priests continue their rituals, pouring libations and burning incense, maintaining traditions that stretch back to a time when, according to the King List, an actual historical document that archaeologists treat seriously, right up until it starts claiming kings reigned for tens of thousands of years, rulers were chosen directly by these gods, legitimized by divine authority, in ways that make modern political legitimacy look refreshingly straightforward. And here's a delightful wrinkle in our bedtime tale. The Sumerians didn't just write about these gods in abstract terms, but placed them in specific cities, assigned them specific functions, created what amounts to a divine bureaucracy that would make modern government agencies look almost efficient by comparison. With Enki and Eridu managing wisdom and water, Enlil in Nippur controlling air and storms, Inanna in Uruk handling love and warfare because apparently those two things go together like peanut butter and existential crisis. The scholarly consensus holds that these represent different city-states projecting their political importance onto the cosmic realm, creating gods who validate earthly power structures, while the alternative interpretation suggests these were actual administrative centers for extraterrestrial operations, each god being a specific individual or role holder in a vast colonial enterprise. The oil lamps flicker, casting dancing shadows on the cuneiform, and you realize that whether these beings were metaphorical or literal, the Sumerians devoted incredible resources to honoring them, building temples called ziggurats that dominated the landscape, organizing their entire society around serving these mysterious Anunnaki, who apparently had very specific preferences about how beer should be brewed, and exactly which cuts of meat made acceptable offerings, which either indicates divine beings with surprisingly mundane concerns, or priests who really understood how to turn theology into a comfortable lifestyle.
The scene shifts now, moving deeper into the timeline that the tablets describe with casual precision that either indicates actual historical memory or the most elaborate mythological framework ever conceived by people who supposedly didn't have writing yet, depending on whose academic camp you've pitched your tent in. The Ajigi gods, those celestial workers assigned to Earth's mining operations, are reaching their breaking point after tens of thousands of years of labor that would make even the most exploitative modern corporation look benevolent, and the tablets describe them burning their tools and marching on Enlil's palace in what amounts to divine revolution, which is either a sophisticated mythological exploration of labor rights or a literal account of extraterrestrial workers unionizing. And honestly, both interpretations make you question everything about hierarchical power structures. The Atrahasis tablet, which exists in multiple copies suggesting this story was important enough to reproduce repeatedly, describes Enlil's fury at being woken by the rioting workers, his immediate assumption that someone should be punished, preferably executed, because apparently divine management style in ancient Mesopotamia heavily favored the beatings will continue until morale improves approach to human resources. The mainstream interpretation treats this as sophisticated social commentary, a way for Sumerian scribes to process their own experiences with forced labor on massive irrigation projects, projecting their struggles onto the cosmic realm, where at least the workers occasionally won their disputes, unlike in actual Bronze Age Mesopotamia, where complaining about working conditions could get you killed in ways that didn't involve metaphorical or literal gods. But the fringe interpretation sees something else, actual beings from another world, facing the same labor problems any colonial enterprise faces, the younger generation of workers refusing to continue the brutal extraction operations their elders started. And this creates a delicious irony, because it suggests that even supremely advanced spacefaring civilizations can't figure out how to prevent workplace dissatisfaction, which means the universe might be fundamentally committed to labor disputes as a cosmic constant. The scent of clay fills your nostrils now, thick and earthy, mixed with the mineral smell of the rivers that made Sumerian civilization possible, the Tigris and Euphrates flowing through the landscape like divine gifts or cosmic coincidences depending on your interpretive framework. And you're watching as Enki, the clever god, the trickster, the one who actually seems to like humans or at least find them useful, proposes a solution that will change everything. The scholarly debate here focuses on what this story tells us about Sumerian concepts of creation and human purpose, with researchers like Thorkild Jacobson arguing these myths reflect the Mesopotamian understanding of humanity's role as servants of the divine, while others note the unusual sophistication of the creation narrative that involves mixing clay with divine blood, which is either beautiful metaphorical poetry or a suspiciously specific description of genetic engineering, depending on how literally you take your ancient texts and how many YouTube videos about ancient aliens you've watched at 3 a.m. Enki's plan, laid out in detail that seems excessive for mythology but perfectly reasonable for instruction manual, involves creating a primitive worker by mixing the essence of a god with the clay of the earth. And if you're reading this metaphorically, it's a lovely statement about human dignity deriving from divine spark. But if you're reading it literally, it's describing in vitro fertilization and genetic manipulation using local hominids and extraterrestrial DNA, which would make us all hybrids created for manual labor, and I'm not sure which interpretation is more existentially disturbing, honestly. The text describes this creation happening in a creation chamber, with specific goddess figures acting as birth goddesses, with one version specifying that 7 males and 7 females are created in the first batch, which is either symbolic numerology or someone keeping very careful laboratory notes about initial test subjects, and the precision is enough to make you wonder why mythology would need detailed production numbers unless someone was actually tracking yields. The mainstream archaeologists point out that creation myths involving clay and divine breath appear in numerous cultures from Genesis to various Native American traditions, suggesting this is a common metaphorical framework for understanding human origins, while the alternative researchers counter that maybe multiple cultures preserve memories of the same actual event, like how flood myths appear globally, because, well, there was probably an actual catastrophic flood at some point that traumatized everyone enough to remember it forever. You can almost feel the clay squelching between divine fingers now, formed and reformed, the mixture of earth and something else, something that the tablets call the blood of a slain god, specifically a god named Wiilu or Geshtui, depending on the version, who is sacrificed for his intelligence and awareness, his essence mixed into the clay like cosmic sourdough starter. And whether this is profound spiritual metaphor or description of extracting DNA from a specimen depends entirely on your willingness to take Bronze Age texts at face value. The jokes practically write themselves here. Imagine being the god who gets chosen for this sacrifice, probably by drawing the short straw, thinking you're going to a party, and instead you're becoming the template for an entirely new species. The ultimate case of I didn't sign up for this, in a universe where apparently even gods can have really bad days at work. The scholarly consensus, articulated by researchers at institutions with more funding than most small nations, insists we must understand these texts within their cultural context, as explanations for phenomena the Sumerians observed: crop cycles, birth, social hierarchy, projected onto divine actors who made sense of an otherwise chaotic universe, which is perfectly reasonable until you start noticing the weird astronomical knowledge encoded in these same texts that supposedly primitive people shouldn't have possessed. The fringe interpretation, championed by people who definitely own more books about pyramids than is probably healthy, points to specific details, like the Sumerian knowledge of all planets in our solar system, including ones not visible to naked eye, their sophisticated mathematics based on sexagesimal system we still use for time and angles, and their sudden appearance as fully formed civilization with no apparent developmental period, as if someone just installed Civilization Update 1.0 without bothering with the beta testing. The creation of humans, according to the tablets, is celebrated by the gods, who are immediately relieved of their labor obligations, and you can picture the Ajigi gods throwing the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of a pizza party, finally getting weekends off after 144,000 years of mandatory overtime, while the newly created humans pick up the shovels and start digging, presumably wondering if consciousness was really such a great gift after all. The texts describe humans multiplying rapidly, spreading across the land, building the first cities under divine guidance, with each major city having a patron deity who acts as mayor, CEO, and spiritual leader all rolled into one, which is either a mythological explanation for city-state formation or an accurate description of extraterrestrial governors managing different colonial sectors, and honestly, the administration of either scenario sounds like a nightmare of bureaucratic complexity. The debate among scholars often centers on the question of human agency in these texts. Do humans have free will, or are they merely created to serve? And researchers like John Botero argue that Mesopotamian religion actually granted humans considerable autonomy within divine parameters, while the texts themselves seem ambiguous, describing humans as both beloved creations and convenient labor-saving devices, which frankly sounds like the ambiguity every employee feels about their relationship with management. The sensory details in these ancient accounts are surprisingly rich. You can almost smell the freshly turned earth as humans begin the work of civilization, feel the weight of baskets filled with soil for the first ziggurat foundations, hear the rhythmic chanting as workers move in synchronized patterns that make impossible tasks merely extremely difficult, taste the dust in the air from construction that will continue for generations, building monuments to gods who may or may not be watching from somewhere beyond the visible stars. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting from a historical standpoint. The Sumerian civilization does appear rather suddenly in the archaeological record, around 4,500, 4000 BCE, already possessing writing, advanced mathematics, sophisticated agriculture, complex social organization, and monumental architecture, leading mainstream scholars to propose various migration theories and cultural evolution models, while alternative researchers point at this and say, see, download from advanced civilization, like they've just proven something decisive, rather than merely pointing out a mystery that archaeology is still actively investigating. The tablets describe the early humans learning various crafts and sciences from the Anunnaki, with specific gods teaching specific skills, Enki teaching wisdom and magic, Enlil teaching agriculture and government, Inanna teaching warfare and love, which is still a weird combination that suggests either sophisticated understanding of human psychology or really poor HR practices in dividing up the training responsibilities. The fringe interpretation holds that this represents actual technology transfer from advanced beings to primitive humans, a kind of cosmic Peace Corps program or colonial education initiative, while mainstream interpretation sees this as mythological legitimization of existing knowledge, the Sumerians explaining their own achievements by attributing them to divine instruction rather than acknowledging human ingenuity, which tells us something interesting about ancient Mesopotamian modesty or their genuine belief in divine intervention. You're standing now at the edge of a massive excavation, watching workers dig canals that will irrigate thousands of acres, transform desert into garden, create the agricultural surplus that makes civilization possible, and whether they're doing this because gods commanded it, or because ecological necessity demanded it, or because extraterrestrial overseers required it, hardly matters to the person actually holding the shovel, which is perhaps the most profound realization. From the ground level, divine mandate and ecological imperative and alien instruction all look remarkably similar, all requiring the same backbreaking labor, the same dedication, the same faith that this impossible project will somehow work. The tablets mention something else too, almost in passing, the kind of detail that gets overlooked until someone really starts paying attention. The Anunnaki apparently age differently than humans, living for tens of thousands of years, which is either mythological immortality, common to divine beings across cultures, or a description of beings whose biological clocks run at different speeds, perhaps due to relativistic effects from space travel, or simply different evolutionary biology. And trying to imagine attending a business meeting with beings who consider 1,000 years a reasonable deadline for a project makes your brain hurt in productive ways. The creation of humans, described in multiple Sumerian texts with variations that either indicate evolving mythological traditions or different groups trying to remember the same events with varying accuracy, becomes more complex the deeper you examine it, the layers of meaning multiplying like fractals, until you're not sure whether you're reading theology, biology, social commentary, or instruction manual. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws heavily from earlier Sumerian sources, describes Marduk creating humans from the blood of Kingu, a defeated god, mixing divine essence with earthly matter, in ways that sound simultaneously mystical and clinical, depending on your interpretive lens. And the mainstream scholarly position holds this represents sophisticated theological thinking about human nature, combining material and spiritual elements, while the fringe position whispers about genetic engineering with the kind of specificity that makes geneticists uncomfortable when they actually read these translations. The scholarly debate here gets particularly heated, with researchers like W.G. Lambert insisting we must understand these creation myths as literary compositions serving specific cultural purposes, explaining human suffering and social hierarchy through cosmic narratives, while alternative researchers point to oddly specific details, like the tablets describing the purification of the divine blood before mixing, the involvement of specific birth goddesses, who seem to function more like laboratory technicians than mystic deities, and the careful notation of how many attempts were needed before the process worked correctly, which reads less like mythic poetry and more like someone keeping very careful experimental logs. Imagine the scene now in whatever passes for a creation laboratory in ancient divine architecture. The smell of incense masks other odors you can't quite identify, the sound of chanting or machinery, or both fills the air with rhythmic precision. The lighting is dim and flickering, or perfectly controlled, depending on whether we're talking about oil lamps or technology, and the atmosphere feels heavy with potential, with the weight of something unprecedented about to happen. The kind of feeling that makes your skin prickle with anticipation, or fear, or possibly both simultaneously. The mainstream historical fact we anchor to here is that the Sumerians possessed remarkably advanced medical knowledge for their time, with texts describing surgical procedures, pharmaceutical compounds, and anatomical understanding that wouldn't be matched in some cases for thousands of years, which conventional archaeology attributes to careful observation and accumulated practical experience, but which alternative interpretation suggests might indicate knowledge transfer from more advanced sources. The tablets describe the creation process involving essence, taken from a god, and clay from the earth, mixed in specific proportions by specific deities, following specific procedures, and if you read this as pure mythology, it's beautiful poetry about human divine nature. But if you read it as encoded technical description, it sounds uncomfortably like artificial insemination, using genetic material from one source, combined with local biological substrate, and the fact that modern readers can map these ancient descriptions onto modern genetic engineering either indicates we're reading too much into primitive metaphor, or that the Sumerians were describing something they witnessed but couldn't fully understand in their own conceptual framework. The fringe interpretation, elaborated in books that sell extremely well despite making academics apoplectic, proposes that the Anunnaki used existing hominids on Earth, probably Homo erectus or early Homo sapiens, as the base genetic material, mixing in their own DNA to create modern humans with enhanced cognitive abilities and reduced physical durability compared to the Anunnaki themselves, essentially breeding us for intelligence and tractability, rather than strength or longevity, which is either horrifying science fiction or horrifying history, depending on which evidence you find more convincing. The jokes here are dark but necessary. Imagine being the first modern human, waking up with consciousness you didn't ask for, looking at your creators expecting parental love, and getting instead a work assignment and a shovel. The universe's most elaborate case of welcome to existence. Now make yourself useful. And whether this happened literally or metaphorically, it's a pretty accurate description of how most humans experience entering the workforce. The tablets mention that early humans were created sterile, unable to reproduce, requiring the gods to create them in batches like manufacturing widgets. But then something changes. The texts describe Enki, ever the rebel, secretly giving humans the ability to reproduce naturally, which either represents mythological explanation for sexual reproduction or an actual act of genetic modification granting fertility to a created species. And Enlil's fury at this development suggests either mythic conflict between divine personalities or genuine political dispute between extraterrestrial factions about whether the created workforce should be self-sustaining. The debate among scholars like Stephanie Daly and Jeremy Black focuses on what these myths tell us about Sumerian attitudes towards sexuality, fertility, and divine human relationships, with most consensus holding that these stories legitimize human sexuality as divinely sanctioned, while also establishing hierarchical relationships between gods and humans. But alternative researchers note the oddly specific biological details like the timing of gestation, the ratio of successful to failed attempts at creation, and the description of what sounds suspiciously like trial and error in achieving viable offspring. You can almost feel the clay under your fingernails now. The strange mixture that's neither entirely earth nor entirely something else, formed into humanoid shape with care that suggests either artistic devotion or biological precision, and whether the breath of life breathed into this form is metaphorical divine inspiration or literal DNA activation, hardly changes the profound strangeness of existence, the mystery of consciousness emerging from matter through processes we still don't fully understand, even with all our modern science. The texts describe the first humans as stronger and larger than modern humans, living longer, possessing abilities that gradually diminished over generations, which mainstream scholarship interprets as mythological Golden Age narratives, common across cultures, the persistent human fantasy that we've fallen from some better state, while fringe interpretation sees this as describing genetic degradation as Anunnaki DNA mixed with more human populations over generations, diluting the enhancements until we arrive at current human capabilities. The scholarly consensus, represented in authoritative works by institutions like the Oriental Institute, and published in journals with names like Journal of Cuneiform Studies, holds firmly that these are sophisticated mythological constructs explaining human condition through divine narrative, serving social functions like legitimizing kingship, explaining suffering, and creating meaning in uncertain world, and this interpretation has decades of careful research supporting it. Thousands of scholars building careers on increasingly nuanced readings of these texts as literature and theology. But then you encounter details that make you pause. The Sumerian knowledge of human gestation period, their understanding of genetic inheritance of traits, their sophisticated mathematics that includes concepts like zero and place value thousands of years before other cultures, their astronomical knowledge including accurate measurements of Earth's precession, and their sudden appearance as fully formed civilization. And while none of this proves extraterrestrial intervention, it does create a puzzle that conventional archaeology is still actively working to solve through migration theories and cultural diffusion models. The creation chamber, whether literal or metaphorical, represents a threshold where something new enters the world, where the possible becomes actual, where potential transforms into being, and you're standing at that threshold now in your imagination, watching as the first humans open eyes for the first time, minds flooding with consciousness like rooms filling with light, and whether what they see is divine faces or alien scientists, or mystical forces beyond comprehension, their experience of suddenly being aware, of knowing they exist, of feeling the weight of existence, this remains the fundamental mystery that no interpretation fully resolves. The tablets describe these first humans learning language, learning to use tools, learning to cultivate crops, and whether they're learning from gods or aliens, or simply discovering through experimentation, the process they describe is education. Knowledge transfer from advanced to primitive, from experience to innocent, and this pedagogical relationship between creator and created, teacher and student, master and servant, runs through all the Sumerian texts with uncomfortable consistency. The fringe theorists point out that human DNA contains what appears to be fused chromosomes, suggesting genetic manipulation at some point in our evolutionary history, though mainstream genetics explains this as natural evolutionary process, and the debate gets technical enough that most people's eyes glaze over, but the basic question remains hauntingly simple. Are we natural or designed, evolved or created? And does this distinction even matter if the result is the same? Confused conscious beings trying to understand their origins, while their origins remain frustratingly ambiguous. The smell of the creation chamber, whether it's incense and clay or something more clinical, fades now as the scene shifts to the aftermath, to humans spreading across the land, building the first settlements, beginning the long process of civilization that will eventually lead to everything we know. And whether this was planned by gods or aliens, or emerged naturally from human ingenuity, the fact remains that something extraordinary happened in ancient Mesopotamia, something that transformed human existence, and the Sumerians recorded it in texts that continue to puzzle and provoke thousands of years later. The cities rise now from the Mesopotamian plain, like fingers pointing accusingly at heaven, or hopefully toward home, depending on whether you're reading these massive ziggurats as human achievement or divine instruction. And the archaeological evidence here is unambiguous. These structures existed, required enormous resources and coordinated labor to build, dominated the landscape in ways that still impress modern engineers, who actually understand load-bearing mathematics and architectural principles. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this section is that ziggurats were temple complexes serving as religious, economic, and administrative centers in Sumerian cities, with the best preserved example being the ziggurat of Ur, dating to approximately 2100 BCE, built by Ur-Nammu as a massive stepped pyramid reaching toward the sky where gods supposedly dwelt, and conventional archaeology has thoroughly documented the construction techniques, labor organization, and social functions of these impressive structures. But the fringe interpretation looks at these same buildings and sees landing platforms, communication arrays, power generators, or navigation beacons for spacecraft, pointing to their precise astronomical alignments, their unusual construction materials, sometimes including bitumen and reeds in ways that might provide electrical insulation, and their prominent positioning visible from great distances, including presumably from orbit, which either indicates they're really good at finding patterns that aren't there, or that they've noticed something mainstream scholarship has overlooked. The scholarly debate about ziggurat function involves researchers like A.R. George who see them as symbolic mountains, linking earth and heaven in Mesopotamian cosmology, physical manifestations of theological concepts about divine accessibility, while others like Harriet Crawford focus on their economic functions as redistribution centers for agricultural surplus and craft goods, and both positions are well supported by archaeological evidence of temple economies and religious texts, making the conventional interpretation quite robust despite being less exciting than the alternative. You're standing at the base of a ziggurat now, craning your neck to see the top platform where priests perform rituals, or where, if you believe the fringe interpretations, gods or aliens actually land their vehicles, and the scale is overwhelming, the precision unsettling, each mud brick perfectly shaped and positioned, the angles calculated with mathematical exactitude, the whole structure embodying order imposed on chaos, civilization manifest in architectural form. The smell here is dust and sun-baked brick, the heat radiating off surfaces that have absorbed Mesopotamian sunlight for millennia, and somewhere in the distance you hear chanting, or machinery, or simply the wind playing through abandoned corridors, sound distorted by massive walls, until you can't identify its source, and the ambiguity feels appropriate for structures whose very purpose remains debated by people who should probably know better by now. The tablets describe specific cities assigned to specific Anunnaki, creating a divine geography that maps precisely onto actual archaeological sites. Eridu for Enki, Nippur for Enlil, Uruk for Inanna, Uacha for Nana, and others, with each city having characteristic architecture, patron deity, specific religious practices, and economic specializations, which mainstream scholarship understands as city-states developing independent identities later attributed to divine patronage, while alternative interpretation sees colonial administration with different governors managing different sectors. The jokes here practically write themselves. Imagine the divine city planning meetings, gods arguing about zoning regulations and infrastructure budgets, Enlil insisting his city needs the biggest ziggurat because he's in charge, Inanna demanding equal height because equality, Enki probably suggesting they all just relax and have some beer instead of measuring architectural achievements, and whether this happened among gods or aliens, or just in the imaginations of city planners trying to one-up neighboring cities. The petty politics of urban planning apparently transcend species and metaphysical categories. The fringe interpretation points to the King List, an actual Sumerian document that mainstream scholars treat as partially historical, which claims pre-flood kings reigned for tens of thousands of years, which conventional archaeology dismisses as mythological exaggeration or scribal error, but which alternative researchers read as actual chronology for beings with radically extended lifespans, either gods or extraterrestrials who age differently than humans. The scholarly consensus, articulated by researchers like Thorkild Jacobsen, holds that the King List combines mythology and history, with the obviously mythical long reigns transitioning to historically plausible reigns around 2900 BCE, representing the Sumerians' attempt to create continuous historical narrative, linking divine past to historical present, legitimizing current rulers through divine lineage, which is sophisticated political theology if not accurate historiography. But then you encounter specific details that create cognitive dissonance. The Sumerian knowledge of planetary orbital periods, their sophisticated water management systems that modern engineers study for principles still applicable, their invention of writing seemingly overnight as fully formed cuneiform script, rather than gradually evolving from pictographs, and their astronomical observations that include detailed records of planetary movements requiring multi-generational observation or access to information from longer-lived sources. The cities themselves tell stories in brick and stone. Here is a granary with capacity to feed thousands. There is a workshop for metalworking using techniques we still use. Everywhere are administrative tablets recording transactions in numbing detail, evidence of bureaucratic complexity that makes modern tax forms look simple by comparison. And whether this organizational sophistication came from divine instruction or human ingenuity or extraterrestrial administration, it represents cognitive capabilities and social coordination that transformed human existence. You walk now through virtual streets of ancient Uruk, the largest city of its time, with population approaching 80,000 people around 2900 BCE. Walls so massive their construction is attributed to legendary Gilgamesh, temples dominating the skyline, markets bustling with trade goods from impossible distances, evidence of commerce and culture and complexity that shouldn't exist according to simple narratives about human development. And mainstream archaeology explains this through gradual accumulation of knowledge and favorable environmental conditions, while alternative interpretation suggests outside intervention accelerating development. The tablets describe the Anunnaki teaching humans various arts and sciences, with specific gods associated with specific knowledge domains, Enki with wisdom and magic, Nisaba with writing and mathematics, Ninkasi with brewing beer because apparently divine priorities include quality fermentation, and whether these represent actual beings transferring knowledge or mythological explanations for human discoveries, the pattern of attributing innovation to divine sources remains consistent across Sumerian texts. The scholarly debate here involves questions about how knowledge spreads and accumulates, with researchers examining evidence for trade networks, migration patterns, cultural diffusion, and independent invention, building sophisticated models of how civilization develops through human agency alone, models well supported by comparative evidence from other ancient civilizations that developed similar technologies independently, which should settle the question, except it doesn't quite explain the specific weird details unique to Sumerian civilization. The fringe interpretation points to global myths about culture bearers and civilizing gods, noting that the Sumerian accounts are among the oldest and most detailed, suggesting this might be the source tradition that other cultures dimly remember, the original account of when advanced beings taught primitive humans the foundations of civilization, which either indicates diffusion of Sumerian myths across ancient world, or preservation of actual historical memory of contact events. The sensory experience of these ancient cities must have been overwhelming. The constant noise of thousands of people living in close quarters, the smell of cooking fires and refuse and incense and humanity in concentrated form, the visual spectacle of processions honoring gods with elaborate rituals, the taste of beer drunk from communal vessels, the feel of cool mud brick walls offering refuge from murderous heat, all of it adding up to urban experience, not fundamentally different from modern cities, except for the whole gods might actually live in that temple over there aspect. The ziggurats dominate everything, impossible to ignore, their stepped pyramidal forms reaching towards sky in what mainstream interpretation sees as symbolic connection between earth and heaven, physical manifestation of Mesopotamian cosmic geography, placing gods in upper realms accessible only through architectural elevation, while fringe interpretation sees functional structures serving practical purposes for beings who arrived from above and required elevated platforms for their technology or vehicles. The archaeological evidence shows continuous occupation and rebuilding of these sites over thousands of years, layers upon layers of human activity, each generation maintaining and expanding structures their ancestors built, and this continuity suggests either persistent religious devotion to mythological beings or ongoing relationship with actual entities requiring these specific architectural forms, and trying to determine which, based on archaeological evidence alone, proves frustratingly difficult, because both scenarios leave similar material traces. The tablets describe festivals and rituals performed at these temples, elaborate ceremonies involving priests and priestesses, sacred marriage rites, offerings of food and drink and precious metals, all following precise protocols recorded in religious texts, with the kind of attention to detail that suggests either these rituals were vitally important for maintaining cosmic order, or someone really wanted to make sure the procedures were followed correctly for practical reasons. The scholarly consensus holds that these rituals served social bonding functions, reinforced hierarchical social structures, redistributed economic resources through temple economies, and provided meaning and psychological comfort to populations facing uncertain agricultural yields and periodic disasters, which is all perfectly reasonable and well supported by sociological models of religious function. But alternative interpretation notes the specificity of ritual requirements, the precise timing based on astronomical events, the careful preparation of offerings using specific materials and methods, and suggests these might be instructions for actual interactions with actual beings who had particular preferences or requirements, less theology and more protocol manual for interspecies contact. The story winds down now like consciousness fading towards sleep, the ancient past becoming even more ancient, the Anunnaki retreating from direct involvement in human affairs, according to the tablets that describe them withdrawing, ascending, leaving humanity to manage its own civilization with varying degrees of success and spectacular failure. The mainstream interpretation sees this as mythological explanation for why gods no longer walk among humans, the universal human experience of feeling abandoned by divine forces, the transition from mythic age to historical age that appears in cultures worldwide, from Greek Golden Age to Nordic Ragnarok, suggesting this narrative pattern reflects human psychology rather than actual historical events. The fringe interpretation naturally sees something else, actual departure of extraterrestrial visitors who either completed their mission or abandoned failed colony or simply left for reasons we can't comprehend, leaving behind structures we still can't replicate and knowledge that seems inexplicable, and whether they departed in spacecraft or divine chariots or simply faded from direct interaction, their absence shapes all subsequent human history. The tablets describe the flood, that universal mythic event that appears in Sumerian accounts as punishment for human noise disturbing divine sleep, which is honestly the most relatable motivation for apocalypse ever recorded, because we've all had neighbors we wanted to flood out of existence after one too many late-night parties. The scholarly consensus treats flood myths as memories of actual catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamian river valleys, traumatic events preserved in cultural memory and mythologized over generations, while geological evidence does show evidence of massive flooding events in the region around 2900 BCE, supporting natural disaster explanation. But the fringe interpretation points to global flood myths, the detailed preservation accounts in Sumerian texts that include specific construction measurements for the ark, the survival of specific individuals chosen by friendly gods to preserve civilization, and suggests this records actual extinction-level event, possibly caused by or at least known to the Anunnaki who warned select humans, making us survivors of cosmic-scale disaster. The sensory experience of ancient Mesopotamia fades now into comfortable darkness, the weight of clay tablets replaced by weight of comfortable blankets, the smell of temple incense giving way to your own bedroom's familiar scent, and whether the Anunnaki were gods or aliens or mythological constructs created by humans trying to understand their place in vast uncaring universe, their legacy remains in every city we build, every hierarchy we create, every time we look at stars and wonder what else is out there. The scholarly debate will continue because that's what scholars do, publishing papers and attending conferences, and building academic careers on increasingly nuanced interpretations of cuneiform texts. And honestly, this is exactly what the ancient scribes would have wanted. Their words still provoking thought and argument. Thousands of years later, immortality through persistent controversy. The ziggurats crumble slowly back to earth, mud brick returning to mud. But the questions they raise remain sharp as fresh-pressed cuneiform. Are we alone? Are we natural? Are we designed? Are we free? Do we have purpose? Did someone make us? And if so, why? And where did they go? And are they coming back? And do we want them to? These questions haunted Sumerian priests 3,000 years ago, and they haunt us still in different vocabulary, using different frameworks, but asking fundamentally the same things about origins and meaning, and whether consciousness is cosmic accident or deliberate creation. The alternative interpretations, whatever their evidential basis, serve important psychological function, reminding us that consensus isn't always truth, that mysteries remain, that our ancestors weren't necessarily primitive fools believing absurd things, but possibly sophisticated observers recording experiences we don't share or understand. The mainstream interpretations, grounded in careful scholarship and archaeological evidence, provide robust frameworks for understanding ancient Mesopotamian religion, society, and culture, contributing to genuine knowledge about human history that enriches our understanding of civilization's development. Both approaches, despite their conflicts, share commitment to taking Sumerian texts seriously, treating them as worthy of attention and analysis, acknowledging that these ancient voices speak across millennia to anyone willing to listen carefully. So as you drift now towards sleep, your mind processing these strange stories about gods from sky, creation in clay, cities reaching toward heaven, floods wiping slate clean, departures leaving mystery, remember that whether literal or metaphorical, these tales encode human experiences of wonder, fear, hope, disappointment, curiosity, and our endless drive to understand where we came from and what we're supposed to be doing here in this strange existence between birth and death. The Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, whether they came in spacecraft or emerged from human imagination, they came, they mattered, they shaped civilizations, and then they left or faded or transformed into memory, leaving behind ruins we still excavate, texts we still translate, questions we still ask. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the questions matter more than answers. Maybe the search for understanding our origins is the point rather than reaching definitive conclusions. Maybe consciousness itself is the miracle, regardless of its source. And maybe you should just sleep now. Let these ancient stories filter through your dreams. Let Sumerian temple chants blend with your breathing. Let ziggurat shadows lengthen across unconscious landscapes. Let the mystery remain mysterious, because some things resist neat explanation, and that's okay. That's beautiful even. That's what makes existence interesting, rather than mechanical. If you genuinely enjoyed this journey through ancient Mesopotamia, and alternative interpretations of cuneiform tablets and scholarly debates about gods who might have been aliens, please subscribe, but only if you mean it, only if you want more of these weird bedtime explorations of history's ambiguous edges, where mainstream meets fringe, and both have something to teach us, if we listen without prejudice. Sweet dreams of stepping pyramids and star beings, of clay mixed with divine essence, of cities rising from desert, of knowledge passed from teacher to student across impossible gulfs of space or time or both, of stories that survive millennia because they capture something true, even if we can't agree what that truth is, and sleep well knowing the universe remains stranger than we imagine, full of possibilities our ancestors intuited and encoded in texts we're still learning to read. End of script. Sweet dreams.